This is lecture 13 in the Western intellectual political tradition. At this point we've looked at the classical Greek tradition, the Roman tradition, the Jewish tradition, and we have begun to move forward in the Western intellectual story into the Christian tradition itself, as it tries to draw together the best of the Jewish tradition, the wisest of the Greek classical tradition, and then the Roman tradition itself. The last lecture I looked at the first 3-4 centuries of Christianity, looking at the tensions in terms of how Christianity engaged the classical world from which they emerged. And there were two strong strands in that. There was the Tertullian Tatian heritage that took the position that all that was needed was the Bible, the revelatory tradition of the Bible, and substantive philosophy and thinking and grappling with ideas and literature from other cultures and the arts, philosophy were not all that important. In fact, they were distractions. But that was always the minor key within Christian thought. The more significant one was drawing deeply from the well of these ancient traditions, their wisdom, their insights, whether it was the Jewish heritage, the classical Greek, the Hellenistic Greek, and then the Roman tradition itself. Now today I'm going to linger with Augustine, because Augustine lived from 354 to 430, and he embodies that heritage of turning the buckets into the deep wells of these classical heritages of which Plato and Aristotle, well, the pre-Socratics, the Roman tradition of Cicero and Seneca. He would be someone today who would probably have 4 or 5 PhDs in literature, philosophy, theology, politics. He had a wide-ranging mind and imagination, who was deeply interested in the insights of all thinkers, women and men, as they tried to think through the best, the noblest, that which was worth living for, both in soul and society and soul in that sense. And so Augustine stands within the Western tradition as one of those towering Mount Bakers, one of those K2s, one of those Everests that anyone who's minimally interested in understanding civilization and culture and religion and philosophy and politics and economics, as it's been thought through in a meaningful manner, Augustine is a peak that has to be scaled. And within the Christian tradition, I have mentioned earlier, it's a polyphonic tradition. Polyphonic meaning many voices, not monophonic, one voices. And Augustine, within the Christian tradition, or the Western Christian tradition itself, for some is seen as the litmus test of all that is good, that is true, that is beautiful, that is insightful, that is wise. But there are those within the Western tradition who dared to differ with Augustine, Pelagius being one, and there were many others. So when we think of polyphonic tradition, the West itself, even though Augustine towers high, his read of the Bible, the way Luther and Calvin, which we will come to much later, would draw from Augustine, or a certain read of Augustine, has positioned Augustine as one of the premier thinkers within Western tradition as well as the Christian tradition itself. But as I mentioned earlier, the Christian tradition is polyphonic, not monophonic, and there are many people within the Latin or Western tradition as well as Christianity that have serious objections to Augustine. Hence he must be read, recognizing the wheat, the tares, the gold, the dross in his thinking. The broader Christian tradition, of which is the Orthodox tradition or the Byzantine tradition that goes further east, has more serious objections to much of Augustine's thinking. And so again, that polyphonic nature of Christianity itself does not necessarily uncritically genuflect to Augustine. So when we think of Augustine, who I'm going to talk about today, very important to realize that there are those who almost see him as the preeminent articulator of the best in Christianity. So it can slip into hagiography or almost worship of Augustine. There are others who can go the other extreme, who are extremely critical of Augustine, both within the Western tradition and then certainly the Byzantine or the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And so in reflecting on Augustine, it's important to understand that as sort of a preface or a porch before we walk through the door into Augustine's life, his prolific writings, and his leadership within a crumbling Roman Empire and the emergence of what was going to become the Christian civilization. And he becomes one of the most significant architects of laying the foundation stones for Western civilization, both for good and for ill, but absolutely essentially that he is known for who he is. So in thinking of Augustine today, as I said, he lives at the end of the 5th century, and 354 to 430, and into the 4th and 5th centuries, really. Briefly, I want to talk a little bit about his life and his journey, because it is significant to understand what he became as a person, and then linger briefly with the autobiographical work done when he was in midlife stride, Confessions, which anyone who is trying to make sense of philosophy at a personal level, in that sense Augustine embodies an early form of existentialism, confessional literature, which is very much with us today. And then I'll touch on his great work, The City of God, that laid the foundations for Western political thought, just in many ways as the Confessions was significant for articulating the individual's journey to meaning and purpose. So Augustine lives at a period of time when Rome, much like the West today, was in a state of uncertainty, chaos, divisiveness, fragmenting, what was seen as the solid Roman Empire that stood for all that was good and true and beautiful from one perspective, was falling apart as a result of this. Cynicism dominated. The quest for meaning was fragmented. The sophists were in the dominance, and on the other hand, there were those who just wanted to get back to the greatness of Rome, Republican Rome, and with the coming of imperial Rome, there had been a thinning out of that great Roman spirit. And then in the arts and culture and literature, there was what we would call today postmodernity. People just had perspectives. Nothing was right, nothing was wrong, nothing was true, nothing was false. All was just a matter of personal interpretations of reality. So between, on the one hand, the agnosticism of the time, of the liberals, depending on how far a person went down that deconstructionist path, and the certainty of a certain type of Roman conservatism that wanted to get back to the glory of Rome and what it stood for in terms of culture and civilization, Augustine emerges. He is essentially, as a young man, intellectually curious, thoughtful. He read voraciously. His journey was such that where the big questions for Augustine was, where does a person turn to for significant meaning? At the beginning of the Confessions is, our hearts are restless, which is very important, beginning to understand Augustine, which makes him perennial relevant, where the hearts are restless for meaning. And so where does our mind guide us in terms of the objects of that search for meaning? What is the table we turn to dine on that we think is going to slake our hunger, slake our thirst for meaning? And so Augustine begins deeply, obviously, coming out of a Platonic tradition, a Hebrew tradition, a Roman tradition in which the heart and desires long for meaning, but where we turn to for meaning can lead to betrayal, it can lead to disappointment. And so how does a person discern what to turn to that is going to slake the deeper thirst or hunger for meaning? And so in Augustine, you get these frantic desires on the one hand, going in a variety of indulgent directions in the quest for meaning. whether it's indulging sexual or sensual appetites, living in common law with someone having a child in a relationship, going to the theater, in which all sorts of bizarre activities and appetites were pandered on the stage and indulged. Was wealth the source that you could turn to for meaning and purpose, or possessions, or was it property? Could knowledge itself answer that restlessness for meaning and purpose? Were there sages he could turn to? There was a multiplicity of religions, obviously because the Roman Empire had spread well beyond the Mediterranean into India and into Egypt, up into Europe. Augustine comes from North Africa, Algeria today. And so of the multiplicity of religious options in the marketplace, from Zoroastrianism to Manichaeism to Middle Platonism to Judaism to the various Roman cults and myths to sophisticated philosophies of, as I mentioned, Middle Platonism, Plotinus. There was a whole range of traditions. So in Augustine, there is this tension between this desire and longing for meaning, but the question always dogged him. What are the places that are the best to go that slake that deeper thirst for meaning, given the conflicting desires within? And how can the mind and imagination, as organs of knowing, properly direct our desires, longing, restlessness to their proper ends, so that it became a deeper inner peace, or in Latin, quiesce within? Augustine had friends on his journey who shared, in that sense, as dissatisfied, disgruntled late Roman Empire thinkers, this desire to turn to that which they thought a gold mine of sorts for the soul, that they thought would solve these deeper longings and questions for meaning. And so as Augustine through his life, as it were, tries one thing after another, in many sense Plato's Cave. Augustine knew his Plato quite well, as any late antique philosophical person did, as well as his Cicero, his Seneca. He certainly understood the forms of atheism that was very common at the time through Lucretius's writings and many other late Roman writers who were trying to argue all life was just a form of subtle materialism or atomism at work. So he understood the challenge of atheism, he understood the challenge of agnosticism, he understood the layered pluralism of religious possibilities. So out of this multiplicity or pluralistic culture that he was living in, how was he to discern with friends what was worth saying yes to, what was worth saying no to? So the bulk of the Confessions in Augustine's journey in his mid-late teens, his early 20s, he was also presented with a form of Christianity today which we would call literalism or fundamentalism, in terms of how the Bible was to be read. And given his background in literature and very much more nuanced, thoughtful ways of approaching a text, this made no sense to him whatsoever, because he had a fairly sophisticated philosophical mind as well. And so the form of Christianity that was presented to him made no sense either. Part of his journey then, as it were, after indulging a variety of appetites, exploring multiple options in terms of the quest for meaning, he then ends up going to Milan in northern Italy, where one of the most prominent intellectuals, Christian intellectuals at the time, Bishop Ambrose, Ambrose came from a senatorial family, which his father had largely been responsible for ruling much of Gaul and Europe. So Ambrose had grown up, and in his own journey, he had slowly found his way to Christianity, and he became the Bishop of Gaul, as Ambrose as bishop. He was also one of the most politically engaged bishops of the time, many often because he had grown up with those who were to become emperors and rulers of Western and Eastern Rome as it fragmented. He could, when he felt the emperors were not true to their emperor calling politically in terms of being just peacemakers, he could be quite firm with them when they were not embodying true justice. For example, when Theodosius goes into Thessalonica and there was uprising, he sent the military in to kill thousands of people. And Ambrose would not allow the emperor even into the sanctuary of the cathedral until there was reparation. And Theodosius knew in many ways that Ambrose was right. Now, it was Augustine who came to finally, given his loneliness, his longing, his lack of answers, his franticness, desires going in a multiplicity of directions. He knew what he didn't want to be. By his mid-late 20s, he was acutely aware, after exploring a variety of diverse options, intellectually, practically, experientially. He knew what betrayed, he knew what created an ongoing, deeper restlessness in his heart, and what for him, at an intellectual, imaginative way, was the best way of ordering desires, or what we call ordo amoros, ordering our loves so that they move to their proper end, and then as a result of that, a deeper centeredness, what T.S. Eliot would call the still point in the moving world, emerges. So when Augustine goes to Milan, he initially cynical, skeptical. He's been disappointed many times in his life. He has idealized certain people, certain positions, only to discover they betray him at the end of the day. And so he's been in the cycle of idealizing. He probes deeper, only to discover that which he had idealized was too shallow. It didn't nourish his restless heart. And so he comes to Milan thinking, now in his mid-late 20s, is this just another merry-go-round? I idealize, I get to know the person, the ideas, and then at the end of the day, it becomes flat. And I just continue, I just get on a different horse on the merry-go-round of potential options on the journey, changing horse from horse, or in Plato's Cave, from one little fire to another, forever chasing shadows. So is there any way out of this cave, any way out of this carousel? And so he sits and listens to Ambrose as he gives his homilies from the lectern in the cathedral at Milan. Certainly a place going to, if any of you ever travel to Europe, just south of Switzerland. It's one of the most northern cities, just across the border. Great cathedral of Milan. Given Ambrose, like Augustine's, fairly sophisticated education and reading in the classics of literature, Ambrose, in that sense, became a mentor, initially from a distance to Augustine, who sat cynically in the pews in the cathedral, increasingly drawn to the integrity of Ambrose as a human being, because often the test of trust is not only the world of ideas, but in fact the person you trust, and their lifestyle, and how they grapple and continue to grapple with important ideas. So Augustine gradually, through months of attending the cathedral, sitting in on the homilies of Ambrose, watching his life and how he moved throughout the city, caring for those on the streets, the destitute, those who had been misused by law and lawyers, and people who took advantage of others, and constantly Ambrose with his priests and deacons and laity trying to make of Milan a just city. Augustine saw in Ambrose someone of much integrity, and he gradually got to know Ambrose. And as a result of that, Augustine's restless heart, in that sense, begins to find a place both in thought and in word and in deed, where he begins to see the pieces of the puzzle that seemed to be so fragmented in his life that didn't fit together began to come together. As a result of that, he leaves Milan, eventually travels back to North Africa, and he thinks that he can, with close friends, because philosophy in that classical sense, the love of wisdom, and Augustine was very much stood within that ethos, that heritage of philosophy. Just wasn't about dissecting ideas and playing a chess game with thoughts and what so-and-so thought. And so it was about transformation, self-understanding. And so because many of his friends deeply trusted Augustine, a bunch of them formed a sort of a monastic community, and tried to ask the question, so how do we now live, if we've taken this faith serious, how do we live it meaningfully and seriously in the world? There became a contemplative community in Northern Africa. Many in the area watched how these people lived in community, and they recognized there was something to their lifestyle. And eventually Augustine then goes on to become the bishop of Hippo in the diocese of Hippo, and he becomes, as Ambrose once was, then Augustine becomes a shepherd of the people. In his journey in the hierarchy of virtues, of the three great classical ascent virtues, knowledge, which is about technique and skill and information. The next level up, a person goes from knowledge, which a person can have, technical abilities. That doesn't mean they're wise. And the next level up is the world of wisdom and insight. That's the world of philosophy. But higher than wisdom itself is love. And of course, Augustine knew both his Jewish heritage, he understood the best of the emerging Christian heritage. He understood what Plato was doing in the Symposium in Phaedrus, of which love is the very highest of all the virtues in that sense. And love is about unity. In a world of disunity, of fragmentation, where people don't know where they fit in anymore, love is that great unifying factor. And so the ascent from knowledge, which is lower, to wisdom, which doesn't reject wisdom, or doesn't reject knowledge, to love at the highest, you get in Augustine the ordering of thinking, the ordering of desires, towards increasingly the movement towards love, which is about unity, about overcoming separation and dissension and fragmentation and isolation, towards the higher unity of love, which was meant in principle of what the church was meant to be in rebuilding the new community. And so in Christianity, the church in that sense became the new polis of Greek, it became the Republic of Roman thought, and it became the nation of Israel. And so in the emerging of Christianity at an intellectual level, it tried to synthesize the very best and wisest of all the civilizations which had preceded it. And at the level of politics, or how people organize and live together, it was about a kingdom of justice, a justice and peace itself, of which the movement of knowledge, which was necessary but not sufficient, to wisdom and love, which were increasingly the mature forms of that which is sufficient in terms of building a new, just, and peaceful world. And Augustine embodied all of this as the Bishop of Hippo, which Northern Africa. And he went on, obviously, to become one of the most significant, as I mentioned earlier, Christian thinkers. Near the end of his life, as Rome was crumbling, as the great empire was dissolving, as the enemies of Rome were coming south and things seemed to be falling apart, many of the conservative Romans argued the reason for the dissolving, the crumbling of Rome, was because Christianity had come to dominate, which was not a warlike religion, it was not an imperial religion. And so Augustine's, one of his final great works is The City of God. In the first 10 books, what he sets out to do, because what was occurring this time, there was a full scale by the Roman conservatives arguing that Christianity was to blame for the fall of Rome. In many ways today we can see this played out in our modern world, where Christianity is blamed for so many things that we face today, whether it's First Nations issue, whether it's patriarchy, whether it's conservative evangelicals lining up behind Donald Trump, whether it's for economic issues. But there's a full scale amongst sort of trendy secular left people today who see that Christianity is the reason we are in some of the problems we are today, ecological issues as well. And in that sense, the critique against Christianity today is no different than what Augustine was dealing with in terms of the critique of Christianity by very conservative Romans in the late antique era. So the first 10 books of the City of God, which was his great magnum opus, Concessions, was written by a younger Augustine, points out book after book how these arguments are fallacious and they make no sense. And he draws from the Roman tradition itself to highlight that these arguments are absolutely inadequate in understanding what Christianity is and why it's to blame. The same today if you have people who are constantly trying to blame Christianity for a variety of problems. Augustine's first 10 books in the City of God deconstructs argument after argument, pointing out they're thin, they don't understand Christianity, they're caricaturing Christianity. And so first 10 books of City of God is a deconstruction of paper-thin arguments, caricatures of Christianity. The final books, 12, from 11 to 22 in the City of God, then creatively articulate, just as Plato was doing against the sophists and skeptics and cynics of his age. He had to point out the weaknesses of their arguments, but Plato was much as was Aristotle, what makes them great thinkers versus cynics and skeptics who only know how to deconstruct, to criticize. A great thinker, also the big question is, okay, you have deconstructed, now what are you constructing? What's the good that one is trying to articulate? What is the good, the true, the beautiful? And then what's the means that's used to achieve such a goal? So the latter part of the City of God pulls together book after book a creative way of thinking through and articulating a vision of a better kingdom than the city-states of Greece, the Republic, the Empire, Rome, or nationalist Judaism in that sense. And so Augustine in City of God, you can see him deconstructing arguments which are fallacious. And in that sense, he, like any cynic, skeptic, points out problematic arguments, in his case against Christianity, but he also then articulates in a creative, thoughtful, meaningful manner what is the way forward. And any great thinker inevitably is critiquing what they see is shallow and thin, but if a person only stops there, they're only got the key in the ignition. The next question you ask, tell me what you want to be free from, but also tell me what you want to be free for. Nietzsche would say, tell me what you want to be free from and tell me what you want to be free for, and you may just be changing cages. Now Augustine, of course, following Plato, very, very much argued, we're going to give you wings to fly like birds so you won't be in any cages in that sense. And Christianity is about freeing the soul, giving it wings to fly above the cages that people imprison them in time. And so when we think of Augustine, then, as I mentioned earlier and as I began, very, very important thinker. He is recognized by some as the preeminent articulator of Christianity in the late antique world, and his thinking, because it has such richness and depth, continues. Others pillory him as one who they think in some of his thinking distorted Christianity. That exists within Western Christianity, also amongst the Orthodox Church also. But in reading any thinker in a polyphonic tradition, whether Western civilization or Christian thought itself, which is so intertwined with Western civilization, it's very important to always be weighing what is the good someone has offered, what may be their blind spots, their Achilles heel, And so in lingering here with Augustine, both in the Confessions and the City of God, as we move forward to think through what is the good Augustine's offered, what may be some of his blind spots, and always avoid the extremes of demonization on the one hand, or only taking the negative of someone then dismissing them, or hagiography on the other hand, which you only look at the good and don't see the problematic elements. And so Augustine today, we'll move on after Augustine next week, because once Augustine dies in 430, it's just a little over a century later that the rise of Islam begins. So as we move through this course in Western thought, by the 7th century we get the rise of Islam, and this becomes the new big challenge as the Eastern and Western Roman Empire is collapsing in many ways. Christianity then has to face its biggest religious challenge, which is Islam, and even to this day these issues are obviously on front stage.